25 years ago, I started my career as a writer with a very ambitious goal, to write a book in 30 days. I didn't have a fancy laptop. I didn't have an iPad. I didn't have the assist of AI, because 25 years ago, I was in solitary confinement where I spent 7 of the 19 years I served in prison. So all I had was pen and pad. But it wasn't even the typical pen, because in solitary, they don't give you a hard pen because they're afraid you might poke someone. So they give you this very flimsy pen. And so I thought to myself, how am I going to write a book in 30 days with this little flimsy thing? And then I had a Hood Einstein moment. And I was like, what if I roll the pen up in some paper? And I had a little experience of rolling things up in some paper. Don't be judging me up in here. And so I wrote that book. And I remember getting down on my cell floor, because that's how we communicated. And I hollered down the cell block, "Hey, anybody want to read this book?" And I remember a guy hollering back down the cell block, "Don't nobody want to read this book? This ain't Oprah's book club." And I was like, man, I got to shank this guy. Never going to get out of solitary confinement. But then I thought about it. And I was like, he just gave me a goal. And so I wrote that goal down. And then I was like, I should write down more goals. So I wrote down a second goal, becoming a New York Times bestseller. And then I wrote down this third goal, and it's the most important goal, is that I will only write things that were transformative in nature. And here's the reason why. When I first went to prison, I got into a conflict. And one of the guys said to me, hey, if you go over to the library and you take the bookends, you can bend that up and you can make a shank. And I remember nervously walking across that yard, going over to the library to get this weapon. And there was an older gentleman. And he saw me, and he saw that look in my eyes. And he said, I know what you come here to do, young fella. It's not worth it. He was like, but I want to show you something. And he took me to this one room in the library where they had all these books written by black authors, none of whose names I knew. There were books by Donald Goins, Iceberg Slim, with titles like Dope Fiend and Pimp. And I read those books, and I devoured those books, because they spoke about a world that I came from. They talked about the underbelly of the streets. They talked about what police brutality looks like in the community back in the 60s. But then those books ran out. And I went back to the library, and he gave me Malcolm X's autobiography. And the only reason I read that book, because the name Malcolm X sounded so gangster. I was like, I got to see what bro talking about. But I read that book, and that book opened up my mind to the power of literature. And I began to read everything I can get my hand on. Now, it wasn't all deep philosophical books. Sometimes it was Jackie Collins, little Hollywood Wives, and little Sidney Sheldon, little Harold Robbins with all them little salacious scenes. But nonetheless, the power of literature had been awakened in me. So I started to send out these manuscripts to all these different publishers. And I never heard back from any of them. I sent them out to rappers, you name it, I was just sending them out. I'm trying to figure it out. And then I decided, you know what? I'm responsible for my own dream. And so I published my first book from prison in 2008, the same year that I went up for parole. I got denied parole, and then I got sued by the Department of Corrections for the cost of my incarceration at that time, which was roughly estimated to be $1 million, because they thought I had got a book deal. And clearly I didn't have $1 million back then, so it was just an exercise in futility. But it taught me a valuable lesson about the power of these systems to block transformative initiatives. But I didn't let that dissuade me, nor did I let the parole denial dissuade me. So I went back up in 2009 for parole, and they denied me. And I went back up in 2010. And on June 22nd, 2010, one day after my 38th birthday, I walked out of prison after serving 19 years time. Now, when I got out of prison, the first thing I did, not the most obvious first thing, but the first thing I did was sell a book out of the trunk of a car. And I began to hustle books. I went to barbershops. I went to nail salons. I went to hair salons. I went to restaurants. I went to gentlemen's clubs. I went anywhere that people were, and I would sell these books. And about 4 years later, one of those books that was in the trunk of that car landed in Oprah Winfrey's hand. Oprah team reached out to me and said, hey, Oprah would love to have you join her for a conversation for Super Soul Sunday at our home in Hawaii. And I got super excited. And then they called back and they said Oprah changed her mind. And I was like, man, I had my whole vision of what Hawaii was gonna be like. And then they said, Oprah wants you to come to her home in Santa Barbara, or Montecito specifically. And I remember pulling up, and the first person I thought about as I pulled into that driveway was that guy on the cell block that said, this ain't Oprah's book club. I was like, dog, I'm at Oprah House. What are you talking about? What you talking about here? So Oprah and I, we were scheduled to have a 45-minute conversation. We talked for 3.5 hours. Oprah went on to write that not only was this one of the best conversations in her career, it was one of the best conversations in her life. And then Oprah read the memoir and said this is one of the best memoirs she's ever read. Now that's a high bar for the woman who has the most famous book club in the world. And I was like, wow. And I thought about the brilliant, beautiful, masterful writers who she had read. And then the book debuted on March 8th, 2016 on the New York Times bestseller list. And then that book began to do this magical thing. It started to transform the way we talk about system-impacted people. It started to transform the way we talk about the criminal justice system. It started to inspire the organizing of organizations to change through bipartisan legislation the population of those who are incarcerated. We started with a very ambitious goal to reduce the prison population by 50%. So far, we've achieved 22%, which was unheard of. That's the power of literature. But then something, thank you. But then something even more magical began to happen. I began to get letters from system-impacted men and women, young people, saying that this book gave them hope, that this book stood as a testament to what's possible, that this book was changing the way that they were thinking about their own lives and giving them the insights and the wisdom and the understanding that they needed to get beyond the circumstances that was limiting them. And I began to get letters from their families and their loved ones and their communities. And then something else happened. That book began to get banned in prisons all over the country. And initially, I was annoyed by it. But as those letters continued to pour in, I became obsessed with the idea that we have to change the way that we treat people who are system impacted. Most people don't realize that the average person in prison has a 3rd grade reading level. It's a systemic issue. The banning of the book is a systemic issue. So I thought to myself, what can I do? So I decided to take all of the positive quotes from all of my writings and compile them into a beautiful book called Composer, The Art of Change. And that book is based on a song that I did with Nas. Just thought I'd let y'all know that. On his Grammy-nominated King's Disease album, sprinkle that in a little bit. But my goal is to donate 1 million of these books to prisons all across the country, come in with people, fellowship, sow love, spread insights and wisdom, because what I fundamentally believe is that the power, the magic, and the beauty of the written word is one of the most transformative tools we have at our disposal. Thank y'all for y'all time. Appreciate y'all. Thank y'all. Thanks, man. Appreciate you.